wonderful to see all of you here, and the room barely sort of is large enough to have us all. And so thank you all for coming tonight for Beyond Disciplines. It's season 2, episode 3, and tonight we're going to explore the connections between the mind and the body in various ways, as we do in Beyond Disciplines. You'll hear from very different perspectives on how the mind and the body are connected and integrated in some way. But this is also part of Wellness Week. This is why this theme was chosen. So it's like, we like the idea of convergence within the faculty, that things add up to one another. So that's another example of chosen a theme that fits well with other types of activities on our campus and beyond. So it's my pleasure also to introduce Simon Bacon from Exercise Science, who will actually be our MC tonight and leading this Beyond Disciplines. So Simon, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Roy. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, bienvenue tous, to this Beyond Disciplines. I have the first set of slides. So, today we're going to be exploring the role of the mind in the body and how this is all interconnected. We have a series of great speakers that I'm going to get to in a second. Just very briefly, I was told to introduce myself so that you can put some context as to why I'm the MC here. So I am a professor in the Department of Exercise Science. I'm also the co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Center, which is the CIUS NIM in this new world. And my area of research is behavioral medicine. So I'm interested in how lifestyles influence disease development and progression. And to make this, that's a kind of big topic, a little bit complex, so to make it a little simpler, I just got a few pictures, show you how this all connects. So this is, at a very simplistic level, this is what I do. I'm interested in how health behaviors, so things like exercise, diet, medication use, smoking, etc., actually influence disease. Diseases I'm interested in are cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, and we're doing some stuff around bariatric care as well. But beyond that, I'm also interested in how sort of the psychological aspects actually influence this process. So interested in how health beliefs influence things like adherence, things like motivation, self-efficacy. How psychiatric disorders then influence those health behaviors. Then also the physiological pathways that this all connects everything together with. And then finally, how all of these pathways actually differ by individual characteristics. So depending on age, sex, gender, etc., how might these things be influenced? And so as you can probably see, from a very basic level, I'm interested in the mind, going all the way through to the body. This was just this is my lab in a sunnier day in Montreal, and our website. So, enough about me, on to the more interesting and important people who are going to be presenting today. Before I get into the order of talks, one thing I just want to reiterate is this is part of Wellness Week, and I want to say a big thank you to the department for putting on another fantastic event. This has been running for several years now, and it's a monumental thing to put together, and so congratulations to you guys. Well done. I also want to highlight that this year the funds that are raised from Wellness Week are going to be going to the Heart and Stroke Foundation, which personally I'm very happy about. They're an organization that have supported my research and an organization I've been very active with on a variety of different levels, and they do fantastic work. So thank you for that. This is our order of speakers. Before I do the order of speakers, one thing at the very bottom, and I'm going to join in here. So we're going to get everyone tweeting, okay? So hashtag Beyond Disciplines and at FAS Concordia. So I'm tweeting right now, okay? This outstanding crowd of people. There we go, got that one. So that's tweeting out in a second. Tweet throughout the entire time. One thing also as well, we're going to have question period at the end, but also there'll be questions hopefully at the end of each talk, very briefly. If you don't want to ask a question in person, what you can do is you can do #BeyondDisciplines #question, tweet me the question, and I will ask it for you, okay? Just if you're, and if you really want to get a hold of me, my two are on the right-hand side. So, enough from me. Now I'm going to hand it over. We have a great panel, a very diverse group of people. And to start with, I'm going to invite Vero Leduc to come up and present herself and then her work.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Vero Leduc. I'm a Horizon postdoctoral fellow at Concordia. So I'm with Milieu, Institute for Arts and Culture and Technology. So that's with the Community and Differential Mobility Cluster. Okay, so I will continue now in English.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad tonight to present some reflection from my PhD. It was a research creation in communication, where I've produced a graphic novel in sign language. When in 2012, I've done a French zine, some deaf people come to me and say, wow, that's very interesting, but I don't understand because it's in French. So I told them, but you are deaf, you're not blind, you can read. And so they tell me, no, sign language, it's a language in its own, it's in itself. So I'm a little bit stressed because English is not my mother tongue. So thank you for excusing my accent. So that's why I came to ask myself, how could I produce a graphic novel in sign language? One of the main concepts was deafhood. So deafhood, it means a process, a journey for all deaf people. Deafness is a term that is often determined by the medical field, whereas deafhood is a process and not a state which focuses on people's existential stance. So, while interrogating affect and effect of deafhood on different levels, I was particularly interested by signed epistemological perspective. For the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, writing is the condition of episteme. That is to say that leaving a trace of language, writing, allows for the development and construction of different knowledge. Writing in our own language is really important. And why? Because our language is how we understand where we come from. It gives you access to your place in the world, according to Alfred Metallic, who defended his first PhD in Mi'kmaq language. But the question remains, how to write in sign language? In Quebec Sign Language, that is a three-dimensional language requiring movement. There is more than 100 movement writing systems, as the Sever manuscript or the Laban notation. But this movement notation system doesn't take in account the linguistic dimension that is so important to sign language. Later on in history, there were sign language writing systems such as the Stokoe notation, certain sign writing, but these sign language writing systems are not used here in Quebec for Quebec Sign Language. So then I've discovered there is mechanical transcription such as Avatar or software that translates from spoken language to sign language or from sign language to written text. But those are prototypes. And for the complexity of interview done with deaf people for my PhD, I've then come to videography as the best media for sign literature. If writing is leaving a trace of a language on a medium, then video as a three-dimensional medium was the perfect media to capture the three-dimensionality of sign language. So to produce this first graphic novel in LSQ, I've produced it from excerpts of 9 encounters with deaf and hearing people. And the translation bring up the issues of embodied and non-embodied text versus a type text. For example, on the image up, you see a deaf person expressing herself in sign language, in Quebec Sign Language, and in the speech bubble, you have the translation in French. Whereas on the bottom, the interview with hearing people were done in French, transcribed in, by text, and then I've translated in Quebec Sign Language. But then I need someone who sang, because hearing people didn't sing. So I need to hire a deaf actor to perform the embodied text in sign language. So then you see the original text is in the bubble in French, and the deaf body performing the translation in Quebec Sign Language. So this first graphic novel in Quebec Sign Language is a bilingual. It really have to be understood in a perspective of sign literature. So you have access to 10 video chapters online for a total of 4 hours. Take it as reading a book. Reading a book 4 hours is nothing. If you think about seeing a movie, then you will feel it too long. But in the perspective of sign literature, you have 10 video chapters, 1 short film for screening. You could see this version at the cocktail before. And now I'm going to show a 2-minute excerpt of the work in progress that was in 2015. It fell on a deaf ear.
So we have time for a couple of questions before we have the next speaker. Just to mention, unlike the Prime Minister, we will allow questions in English and French. Does anybody have a burning question they'd like to ask right at this moment? We have a microphone if you want to come up to the microphone, or I think we have a roving mic as well. We will have a big question period at the end, so I know you probably need a little time to warm up. Okay. I have one quick question, which is, you know, in the video, you used, you know, the imagery is sort of almost cartoon-like. I'm just curious to know why you used that kind of imagery, the poignancy of it.
So I'm a big fan of graphic novel. So the idea was really to make a graphic novel, how to make a graphic novel in sign language. So that's why I come to use the code of comics, such as the phylacter, the bubble, speech bubble, and the effects of a comic. And I particularly like the black and white effect of graphic novel and movie. So that's why I use this cartoon special effect. Yeah.
Gives a very powerful image to it. Fabulous. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Christophe Grover.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm a professor here in physics. I'm also part of Perform Center, and my main specialization is working with different kind of imaging modalities that are trying to explore how brain activity is working. So I'm going to talk to you about one of them. So I mentioned a new imaging technology. As you will see, it's going to be quite new. So if you heard about it, I'm going to talk to you about electroencephalography, which is actually quite not new at all, but probably the oldest one. So what is electroencephalography? It's just measuring neuronal bioelectrical activity by placing electrodes on the scalp. So this is the only thing you do. You place electrodes on the scalp, and you measure neuronal activity. The great point is that you can measure it every millisecond. And I'm going to show you how this technique can be used to explore like the body and the mind, showing different interactions. It's going to be a bit more technical on how we use that technique to be imaging, but there's going to be many applications linked to the other talks, notably. So as I said, it's not new. The first recording was in 1925 by Dr. Hans Berger, and that was the kind of recording we had first. And as you see, there is a sine wave here at 10 hertz. So what you see in that very first recording was already something that is quite new in the EEG field, is a burst of rhythmic activity at 10 hertz, which is the alpha band activity. So if you all close your eyes and relax, and you're going to have a demonstration station over there, you should all generate alpha rhythm. So not too much, because hopefully you will fall asleep, and that's not what I want. So then, basically, you can measure bioelectrical activity by just placing electrodes and measuring a difference of electric potential between them. So there have been different systems to do it, like very standard montage, where you place electrodes in very well-known places that are reproducible from one subject to the other, so that neurologists can talk together saying, I found activity in F9, we know that is frontal left, and so on. But we can do more than that, actually. Either we place like 20 electrodes that we attach manually to the scalp by just gluing them with a small gel to have an electric contact. And now we have cap of 32, 64, and up to 256 electrodes. And from that, you measure ongoing brain activity, which looks like that. And you have different kinds of brain activity. I won't have time to cover them all. Just to give you a brief idea, if you are awake and alert, you should generate beta activity around 20 hertz. You close your eyes, it's going to be around 10 hertz. So 10 cycles per second. If you start falling asleep, then it's going to be slower waves, and so on. So you can explore many other things. This is another thing where EEG is quite good, and it has been first proposed to study epilepsy, because this is ongoing activity of an epileptic patient, and at some point it generates some plop, plop, discharge like that. This is not an epileptic seizure. The patient is not aware of that, but this is generated from brain regions involved in the region. The reason why I'm showing you that is because it looks great like that. But on that study, this was done before surgery. So what they did, they had intracranial EEG, so electrodes that were implanted in the brain. And what's happening in the brain when you see that from the surface is actually looks like that. So there's quite more happening in the brain than what we can measure. So EEG is a great tool, but I want you to keep in mind that we only see the tip of the iceberg. So we mainly see cortical activity, something from the surface, not much from the middle. And at the very beginning, EEG localization, so where are those discharge came from, were done like that. So you model the brain as a sphere, and the location is just a small point. Of course, it was not that bad. It was confirmed with intracranial EEG at that time, but we want to do more than that, and that's what I'm going to show you now. We want to convert this EEG into a real 3D spatiotemporal imaging technique. To do that, we have to solve a difficult problem that we call ill-posed inverse. So that problem has no unique solution. It has an infinite number of solutions, and this is where you need physicists or engineer like me to try to solve that. And this is why you need to import some knowledge. So what kind of knowledge we do import? First, we're going to put more electrodes. So instead of just 20, we're going to cover. This is 256. Then we want to know exactly where are those located. So we use a nice machine like that, which is a machine equipped with 11 cameras, so that are just taking pictures. So this is exactly like Matrix movie. When you have all those cameras, you can then reconstruct in 3D what's happening. So if you do those pictures of the camera, then you can reconstruct where are those electrodes on the scalp. Then more than that, you need to know where are those signals generated in the brain. So to do that, we know that in the brain, the main generators are along the cortex and along the cortical surface, and the main generators are perpendicular to that cortical surface. So this is an anatomical information that we're going to use. So basically, we're going to localize activity along the cortical surface. More than that, we know, and that's the main problem for EEG, we know that when EEG signals are crossing the skull, they get spatially smeared. They are very smooth spatially. They go all over the scalp. And that's one of the main problems with EEG. This is why EEG technique is so difficult, because for years it has only been modeled as a sphere, and having that problem with just a sphere model is not realistic enough. So now we use anatomical MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, to model, like 3 layers, to model the effect of the skull. So once we do that, we can do actual pretty imaging. And we can do this imaging alone, or we can do this imaging in the fMRI. fMRI is another technique where you measure blood flow, hemodynamic activity. So here we do the two of them together, and I'm showing just a very basic acquisition where I'm just showing a checkerboard like that, that is reversing like that. And then 100 milliseconds after that, this is the kind of signal and kind of measure. So this is the original signal, and you will see that 100 milliseconds here. After that, there is an activity. I hope the video starts. Okay. And this is what you can measure on the scalp, and this, I think it's, okay. I won't touch the pointer, it's changing. And you have the activity on the scalp and the main generator. So now you have a real 3D spatiotemporal image that was done on that. So a few conclusions about, I will skip that, about EEG and identity EEG. So it's a realistic, with realistic model, we can have very accurate source imaging. We can do spatiotemporal image on the cortical surface every millisecond. It's an ideal technique to study epilepsy or sleep, but lots of other aspects like evoked response, ongoing brain oscillations. It can be combined with other techniques, notably in sleep and epilepsy. What is very important is that EEG is cheap and more portable, like wireless technology is coming along, so we can use it to monitor, to do monitoring in actions while you do something. Of course, you have to handle other kind of artifacts, but you can measure an EEG while you're walking or while you're standing or something like that. And some more advanced approach, you can use brain-computer interface. You can decode signal from EEG to control a computer, a video game, or even a robotic arm. Or you can have the image I was showing you as a feedback. I can show that image of my brain directly in real time, and I can do that to do some neurofeedback, to do some training, like to treat attention or depression, for instance. So I will end up on that. These are just 2 videos here where I'm showing you a localization on EEG during a visual task, and a localization here on, this is actually MEG, but this is related to that, on epileptic activity. So just to show you the kind of nice images we can have on that. Thank you.
question.
So for people who have ADHD, what exactly do their brain waves look like?
I'm not an expert in ADHD, so I won't answer to that. So there are some specificity in some of the brainwave, or if you do a specific, you can design a task that is designed to look for attention. So you have different tasks that are addressing the level of attention, and then, of course, you have your score, like you would do in psychology, but here you would have answer on the images, like the delay of the response, the amplitude of the response that's going to change. And of course, in terms of neurofeedback, I think it's with some slow wave activity that's something, but I'm not sure about that, so I won't answer on
All
that.
right, thank you.
And we had one other quick question.
Is the idea that with a better brain model, we won't need to complement the EEG with an fMRI to get better localization here, or will you always require the two modalities to do that?
So there are two things. I think you need an anatomical model to get a good imaging. So having an anatomical MRI to propose the underlying surface. Doing EEG with fMRI, so with functional MRI, that's another business. That's important in some specific example, epilepsy or sleep, where you want to record the two measures at the same time. Otherwise, if it's a well-controlled EEG study, it's always better to do EEG only. But to use a good anatomical model to reconstruct the activity.
Thank you very much. Okay, so next it's my great pleasure to introduce the star of the show from the Department of Exercise Science, Jeff Dover. No bias there at all. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good evening. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak here today. My name is Jeff Dover. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Exercise Science. I also have an affiliate membership with the Perform. I'm a researcher there, and also with the CREER, with the Constance Lethbridge, which is a rehab center across the street. So today I'll be talking briefly about my line of research and why we study pain, and then we focus on pain-related fear and how it can predict function. So my line of research attempts to answer why some people feel more pain than others, and then how that increase in pain affects recovery and function. Pain is a big deal. It affects a lot of people across the world, and there's a lot of people examining different ways of making it better. About roughly 50% of the people in the U.S. see a physician with a primary complaint of pain. That's similar in Canada as well. In Canada, we have some significant healthcare concerns regarding pain, since so many people have it and the way our healthcare system works. A good example of how much it impacts us is that citation at the end there. Sorry, I'm too tall for the microphone. 7% of workers' compensation claims represent about 70% of the cost. So even though there's 93% or other types of injuries that people suffer at work, the 7% of the low back pain accounts for 70% of the cost. And that's because once someone has low back pain, it usually stays for a long time. Once they have it, it comes back. And we don't really have very many good ways of treating low back pain. And so there's a lot of people looking at this now. Something that came out, this guy in the 80s decided to try to figure out why some people get low back pain and it develops into chronic pain. So some people get an injury, like a back strain, and they rehab and they're better within 6 weeks, and other people get a back pain injury and they're rehabbing it still in 2 years. And so he tried to develop a model to explain how some people took that long to rehab. And there was a landmark study that came out in '87 that was one of the first to show that there was a little correlation between pain and disability, and that's a really big deal. So in terms of the healthcare profession, how most people are taught is a biomedical orientation towards pain. And what that means is that if you have a ligament sprain, if it's very minor, you won't be in a lot of pain, then you'll be pretty functional. But if you have a really bad ligament sprain or a tear, it'll be more pain and you'll be more dysfunctional. And that's how everyone is sort of taught in the healthcare profession. And this was the one study that showed that there was little correlation between the amount of pain that they felt and how dysfunctional they were. So that was, no one had ever really seen that before. So then this is what his model looked like, and this is the connection between the body and mind. So you can see here at the top, it starts with experiencing an injury, and then you get some sort of painful experience, and then you can sort of go one of two ways. One where you have a catastrophize the injury. That's also not a real word, just so I feel like I have to explain that. It's with the French and English, with the translation, I apologize to try to have to explain what that word is. But that is, catastrophizing is making pain worse than it actually is. Then there's the fear of movement or re-injury, an avoidance, which then can lead to an increase in the disuse of movement. And then you get stuck in this cycle. And these are the people that get stuck rehabbing an injury for a long period of time, up to 2 years. Then the other way is when you experience pain, there's a non-catastrophizing. You confront the pain, the rehabilitation, and they get better. And so this model was developed to explain why some people go this way and some people go this way. Now, this is a very powerful thing that came out. They just come up with some questionnaires that you can hand people, and they can fill them out. And if they score high on the questionnaire, that means they'll be rehabbing their back pain for 2 years. And if they score low on the questionnaire, that means they'll be back within 6 weeks. And so that was a really big deal, again, when that was found, because that means that when someone comes into the clinic, you could literally, before you even look at them, you could have them fill out a piece of paper, and that would tell you how long they're going to be rehabbing for before you even put your hands on them. And so there was a lot of people that struggle with that idea, but that's what this means. This is one of the questionnaires. If you fill it out, it can predict your function 12 months later after the rehabilitation. So part of our lab studies that and work-related injuries and how that affects how we can predict how long someone's going to be out for. But I'm also interested in athletes. I'm an athletic therapist myself. And if there was some way that we could predict how long an athlete is out with an injury, that would be a really big deal. For those of you who are hockey fans, it would have been really nice last year if we could identify how long Carey Price was going to be out, and to a lesser extent, Brendan Gallagher. But anyway, so when we use these questionnaires, we did that here at Concordia, where we measured athletes and was trying to predict their recovery from injury, and it didn't work very well, partially because the scales were developed for the regular population, and the wording didn't really match with some of our athletes and what they felt. So then we developed, one of my master's students and I developed a fear avoidance scale for athletes. This is something we published a couple of years ago. This was on healthy people. It's just a development of the scale. And then we wanted to test it on actual injured athletes. So that's what we did now. So this is Erica Porter. This is one of my master's students right now. This is what her study has looked like. So we'd have an athlete that suffers an injury here. We have them fill out those questionnaires. They go undergo their regular rehabilitation, however long it takes. If it takes longer than 2 weeks, we measure them every 2 weeks until they return to play. So in here you can see we measure them again, and then that's them returning to play for this particular injury. Just took over a little over 2 weeks. Okay, so this is some preliminary data that we have now. Here's a scale on function. 100 would mean you're completely disabled, and 0 means you're fully functional. So they would average around 47, and then when they returned to play, it was around 9. It's not 0, and that makes sense because most athletes aren't fully recovered by the time they go back when they return to play. This is the amount of pain they were in when they were within their first injury. And then this is how much they were when they returned to play. Again, it's not 0 because rarely are they fully recovered by the time they return to play. But this was nice to see. We had, from our fear avoidance questionnaire, it was also high, and it was low when they returned to play, meaning that it could correlate to their return to function. So we only have a few athletes tested now. We're doing more of that, and then there'll be more analysis we have to do now. But we're pretty excited with the preliminary result, being able to look at measuring athletes' fear avoidance and seeing how it's correlated to rehabilitation. So, in conclusion, pain-related fear, the psychological predisposition to pain may play a role in the successful rehabilitation of the athlete. Things we continue to look at here at Concordia. As you can tell, none of this could be done without the help of my students, Vanessa and Erica, and I've had many opportunity to work with some great people to help me with that, so I wanted to say thanks to them. Thank you.
So, open the floor to questions. Yep, we have one over here.
I was wondering if your questionnaire was considering chronic injuries too, or just acute ones.
That's a good question. Right now, we're just looking at acute injuries, and then the chronic would be something different. But yeah, that's just for the acute musculoskeletal injuries. Because the way I looked at it is that, you know, for people with chronic pain or chronic disability, they're not going to be competing regularly. So this is more of like if someone sprains an ankle and they'd be normally out like 7 days, would they be out 10 days if they had a high fear avoidance or something? So that's something we were looking at.
Another question over here.
Hi, my question was about the questionnaire as well. I saw that it was on 50. How do you assess if they answered critically? Do you compare from the beginning to after, or is there a number that you target where you say this is strong, this is mild?
Oh, that's a good question. Most clinicians want that. We want a cutoff where, like, if you're above this number, that's bad, and below that number, it's okay. But we don't have a cutoff. It's more of a relationship, a correlation between the score and then when they return to play. You also in there, you have in terms of, let's see, how fast they fill it out or how reliable it is. Like someone could lie on a questionnaire. We had a case where there was a player who was still injured and pretty disabled, and they were going to be returning to play that day. It was on the day of the football game. And they came in and they just, on the functional questionnaire, they didn't even read the questions. They just circled all the zeros because they were telling themselves, like, oh, yeah, I'm good, like whether they were or not, you know. And so then my student looked at me and I said, well, we can't use that one, you know, because they're lying on it. So so yeah, it's whenever they fill something out, we always ask them to be as honest as possible, and that's one of our, you know, it's a tough part of the study.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, my great pleasure to invite Virginia Penhume up to be our next speaker.
So I'm really, really pleased to be here, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about a particular study that one of my students did looking at brain plasticity, not brain elasticity, although maybe we'll get there, and dance. So what I study in my lab is how we learn new motor actions. So we can think about actions like in sports. So my favorite and many other people's, Leo Messi. We can think about the context of music learning, so Pau Casals, or we can think about dance. And one of the things that as a brain scientist I think about is that when we learn a skill, when we learn to play soccer, when we learn to dance, when we learn to play an instrument, we train our bodies, but at the same time, we also train our brains. So what my lab has done is we have looked at how long-term training in music and now in dance changes the brains of those who practice. So studying the brains of dancers and musicians is interesting from a neuroscientific point of view because it gives us insight into how the brain changes when you have an ongoing activity, particularly something that you start often very early in life. And dance and music allow us to look at things like changes in the brain that are influenced by learning motor control, right? This is something that's common to both music and dance. Visual and motor imagery, right? You have to imagine what you're going to do. You have to be able to remember in order to be able to perform. You have to learn sequences of movements. You have to synchronize your movements, both with other musicians in the orchestra, or if you're a dancer, with the music that you're hearing. But there are also differences between music and dance. So dancers, of course, use their whole body. Musicians usually use very specific effectors, maybe their mouth, maybe their fingers. Dancers move to music. Musicians produce music. As I said before, musicians use specific effectors like their fingers, and the level of timing that you need for music, really rapid passages, usually different than dance. Slower, whole body rhythmic movement. So what we did in this study is we compared brain structure between dancers and musicians, people who had studied over a long period of time. And we matched these people to groups of highly trained musicians and dancers for the number of years that they had trained, for their age, right? Because the brain changes with age, so we want to compare people who are the same age. And for sex, because there are differences between men and women in terms of their brain, in terms of their sex. So this was work that was done by my student Chiara Giacosa, who is herself a dancer. And what we did with these people is we had them come into the lab, we had them do musical tasks, so melody discrimination, and we also had them do a dance task, where they had to dance along to a dance video, and I'll show you some examples. To study brain structure, we scanned their brains using MRI, which allows us to measure both the gray matter, so the cortical structure, and the white matter, so the connections between regions. And in particular, we used a relatively new brain imaging technique, diffusion tensor imaging, that specifically looks at connections. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just escape out, and I'm going to show you what we had our controls and our dancers do. Thank you. So this is one of our controls. This is somebody who doesn't have music training and doesn't have dance training. They're watching a dance video game. I think some of you may have seen this. And they're trying to dance along. Right? So it's kind of like an aerobics class a bit. And you can see this person without a lot of training is able to do pretty well, not too bad. But now let me show you what one of our dancers looks like. So she's got the same terrible music, but look at the way she's moving, right? She's got a lot smoother movement. If you can't see it well, but she's able to synchronize much more accurately than the person who's the control. And this, of course, doesn't surprise us. She's had at least 10 years of training, but this is what we use to be able to look at music and dance performance in our two groups. So hopefully that's going to stop in a second. And what we showed, unsurprisingly, is that dancers are better at the dance task than the musicians and the non-dancer, non-musicians. And dancers are, and musicians are better at the musical task. But what you really care about is, of course, the brain, or at least that's what I really care about. And what you can see here is using this diffusion tensor imaging, there are a number of regions of the brain that were different between the dancers and the musicians. And these regions were in the corpus callosum, so this green region. This is a huge bundle of fibers that links the motor cortices of the two hemispheres. It allows me to do bimanual tasks. So greater connectivity, greater dispersion of connections. Also in the corticospinal tract, these are the pathways that go from the motor cortex to the rest of the body that allow you to perform these actions. And very importantly, what we call the superior longitudinal fasciculus, you can forget about that. It's the region that connects auditory, visual, and motor regions of the brain. The other part that we thought was really exciting is not only do we see these differences in brain structure, but it's related to your performance on the task. So dancers, better performance on the dance task, show greater dispersion of connections in these regions of the brain. So we're showing a relationship between these changes in brain structure that occur with training and your actual performance on a task that's related to your skill, this dance imitation task. So why would we want to do this? What are the implications? I've told you that trained dancers show these more widespread connections between auditory, motor, visual, spatial brain regions. In the future, we'd like to know, are these predispositions, right? Maybe these people's brains started out this way. There's a reason why they became dancers and I did not, right? Their brains are wired up already differently. But we think there's likely to be some combination. It's not just predisposition, you also need to train. So by studying these kinds of expertise, we can find out more about what are predispositions for particular kinds of tasks, but we can also find out about ways we can change the brain, and this could be very interesting for intervention or for therapy. So there are already therapies out there for things like Parkinson's disease where dance is used. A colleague of mine is using it to train social interaction in autism. So there are a number of areas where this could be useful. And I'll just stop at the end like everybody else and say a big shout out and thank you to my collaborators. Up at the top, looking glamorous, is my collaborator at the U of M, Krista Hyde. Felicia Carpati, another dancer. Both Krista and Felicia are dancers as well, her student. And Joe Thibodeau, who is my fabulous technician who makes everything in the lab run.
We have time for one question. If someone has a question, yep. Just speak.
Sorry. So thank you very much for the talk. How did you assess dance performance in this type of setup here?
There's two ways we did it. Actually, we just cheated and used the video game, right? You get a score. So they did all the hard work of matching the movements, right? So when you do this task, it's a Wii type of technology. So it has an approximation of where your hands are in space and whether you made the movement at the correct time. There could be much more sophisticated ways that you could do this, but you would need an engineer at your disposal.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So, it's my pleasure to introduce Maya Hay, who is our last presenter of the evening.
Thank you. I have to apologize in advance. Spoiler alert, I study food. There will be food pictures, and it's about that time. I apologize. This always happens. So, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Maya, and I come from a hybrid background of both the laboratory sciences and the culinary arts. And I'm currently pursuing my PhD in communication studies. So you might be wondering, communication studies, food, how does this work? Stay with me. Today I'm going to be bringing a humanities perspective to this discussion about the mind and body. I also work at the Speculative Life Lab at the Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology, where I study fermented foods really as an intersection between humans, microbes, and microbial foods. For example, when I eat a probiotic yogurt, my partial digestion of the live, active bacterial cultures allows these microbes to occupy and live within my intestinal lining. I incorporate them into my microbiome, and they incorporate me into their ecosystem. At what point, though, if ever, do they become part of my corpus? Fermented foods are at the intersection of many binaries beyond self and other. In both theory and methodology of working with fermented foods, I challenge the notion that the mind and body are split. In my presentation today, I will argue for the integration of mind and body, for the degendering of mind and body, and for the continued investment in research creation as a critical method, because it acknowledges academic pursuits that are embodied. And these approaches are relevant, especially to Wellness Week, because I believe that wellness is predicated on enticing both the mind and the body. So, part one, embodied learning. My research integrates the mind and body in two ways. One, I engage my senses, and two, my body becomes a site for knowledge production. Fermentation is an unpredictable art. Results may vary from delicious to dangerous, and I must rely on my senses to feel my way through the transformative processes of fermentation. With no terminal state or hard-set recipe, my research requires that I think with my body. Even with quantified recipes and equipment measuring and all of that, I must interpret the actions of microbial life to know what they are doing. When I brew beer, for example, I can hear when the wort is finished with its primary fermentation and when it's ready for bottling. I can smell when kimchi is done. And I can see the biofilm of kombucha forming, which signals to me its readiness to drink. Whether the proof is visual, olfactory, auditory, or tactile. My entire body must be engaged in my work. When working with the dynamic, the transient, and the unpredictable, the integration of headwork and handwork is crucial. Food scholar and feminist philosopher Lisa Heltke writes on cooking as a mentally manual activity. She writes, quote, "The knowing involved in making a cake is contained not simply in my head, but in my hands, my wrists, my eyes, and nose as well. I know things literally with my body, that I, as my hands, know when the dough is sufficiently kneaded, and I, as my nose, know when the pie is done." End quote. Epistemologically, it is not my mind, but rather parts of my body that come to know. When bread is done baking, my nose knows before the oven timer will tell me. When parts of the body stand as proxy to the self, knowledge is thus produced in and through my body. Part 2, the mind-body split. And this split has historic roots in Cartesian dualisms, as well as Enlightenment notions of the capital S self. Feminist scholars write about this split being highly gendered, with intellect associated with the masculine and corporeality associated with the feminine, the implications of which reverberate into the contemporary society with divisions in labor and spheres of domesticity. To challenge the gendered constructs of mind and body, I call upon feminist scholars to interrogate this mind-body divide. Through their critical lens, I argue for the decoupling of physical and cognitive capability from gender and humanness. Fermentation is in a perpetual state of becoming and change, which reminds me of what Elizabeth Grosz calls the hormonal irregularities and unpredictabilities of cisgendered female bodies. Other feminist scholars extend questions of androcentrism, which is male-centeredness, and anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, to frame encounters with the other as a critical intervention. These scholars bring to the fore affect, relationality, and vulnerability. In so doing, their theories push back against the politics of privileging certain beings over others. And fermented foods are alive in a way that problematizes human control. As a result, working with fermented foods changes my anthropocentric approach of working on microbes to working with them. And last but not least, research creation as a methodology acknowledges that one way to know is to do. As a process, it enables me to pursue my research question in a way that other modalities cannot, because research creation addresses the materiality of minded, embodied work. There is only so much we can do with words before we run into the limitations of text. The menu is not the meal. In a recent project, I made a cheese that was made using the bacteria that live on my hands. And it is only when the cheese is presented in physical form that people can react to it and question what goes into our notions of edibility, what constitutes contamination, how we imagine pure and impure bodies, and how we decide to eat other living beings. Additionally, research creation can provide opportunities for modeling interventions on multiple scales, from microscale nurture to macroscale community food education programs. Research creation provides opportunities for material engagement. To recap, the mind and body cannot remain split, especially not on gendered terms and not in the academy. Some approaches I discussed to mend this mind-body divide include: 1, collapsing the mind-body binaries because their ontological separation guarantees non-interaction. 2, embodied learning and knowledge production through mentally manual activities. 3, feminist theories that degender notions of ability and cognition. And finally, research creation as a methodology in which one way to know is to do. I titled this presentation as Recipes for Mending the Mind-Body Divide because of the limitations I experienced when I was a dietetic intern. Recipes, food knowledge, and nutrition information alone do not guarantee behavioral change. I found through my research that engaging the everyday eater requires hands-on material practices. And ultimately, I believe that integrating the mind, body, and everyday activities will lead to better health outcomes for every mind and every body. Thank you so much.
So before I ask all the other panelists to come up, we'll give Maya just a couple of minutes. So if there's some questions specifically for her, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, we can't just let that go. Did you like collect the microbes? Did you just stick your hand in it? Like, tell me more about hand cheese.
Mason jar of milk, dunked my hand in, incubated that, and then I made cheese out of that. So traditionally when cheese is made, you have to acidify the milk, and that's usually through adding lemon juice, citric acid, or just letting the milk sour overnight. That's how it was done traditionally. But on our hands, lactobacillus, which produces lactic acid, right? I used that to acidify the milk, and I made the cheese using that. And I've chosen, right, very public parts of my body. This is part of a larger project where I'm using microbes that live on my body as ingredients in foods. So I'm using the hands to make a handmade cheese, pun intended. Tee-hee. I've also making a bread made from sourdough that uses yeast from my cheek, right? So I'm thinking of the European greeting, the North American greeting, right? These are very public areas, right? And very social, right? And so I'm not trying to gross people out. I'm really just trying to like poke at the fabric of why do we consider some things to be edible and some not? I'm not grossed out. Excellent. We can talk. We'll talk.
One follow-up question to that is, so what does hand cheese taste like?
You know, many people have said it tastes like cotija cheese. It has the same kind of crumbly texture to it too. So it's like a Mexican style kind of dry cheese. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm now going to ask all of the presenters to come and sit at the front here. And we have about a 20-minute period for open questions. Okay, I'm going to start off a question, and this was something that sort of Maya touched upon, and something that's always for me been an interesting underpinning of the work that I do. And this is the kind of concept of mind-body dualism versus monoism. So the idea that there is a inherent connection between the mind and the body, and the mind is just a function of the body, versus sort of the more kind of spiritualistic concept whereby the mind is an aura that supersedes the body. And I just, be interested to see what the panel's perspective on that is, and in relation to their work as well. Start with the easy ones.
Yeah, no pressure. Anyone else? Anyone else?
No, you got it.
No dualism. I mean, I study the brain, right? So the mind is the brain.
Yeah, Christoph, you got two microphones there. You got to answer these.
You have no choice.
Yeah, I'm interested with the language, so how we perceive knowledge, and how the fact reading a text without a body, so a typed text, will render some information, as when we are seeing someone signing, it's render totally different information. For example, if I'm writing a text, I could wonder, will I tell I'm a woman, a white person, how I am? When I'm be singing, those questions I can ask myself, my body is talking for myself. It will show I'm a white woman, well-educated, so how it affects the perception of knowledge, if I could say in one sentence.
Just as a comment on, so to make the link, like, of course, there is a link between the brain and the body, and like, just to go back on your example on the gut and the microbiome, actually there have been some studies where you can definitely relate how you act on the biome and on some specific molecules will change in your brain. Like you can use MR-based spectroscopy to measure that, and you're going to have different kind of things. I'm not an expert in those fields, and that's happened. And otherwise, like when we act with the kind of measurements we can do to measure the brain, we can directly measure brain during an action, and we can also predict, like the brain, when I'm intending to do that task, I can use the signal here to predict that I'm doing that and to do it before. So some of the first experiments to do that for brain-computer interface, if you just want to have a slide, play some slides and press the button each time you want to pass some slides, you can actually trick the stuff and predict that the guy is going to do that, and you're going to do it just before he's doing it, and you have the impression that like someone is talking to you, but it's not. It was just your brain.
Building off of my talk, for me, the mind and body become most integrated in the kind of improvised aspects of cooking, in terms of, I start to saute onions. I don't know what I'm going to make, but something happens. And it's this kind of immediate feedback of what I sense and what I do in kind of perpetual dialogue. And I'm also relating that to also more artistic improvisations too, in terms of like dance improvisation or music improvisation, right? There's, in those situations particularly, the mind and the body have to become one.
Okay, thank you. I have a question at the front here. Oh, Jeff, did you want to? No? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, so my question was for Jeffrey, because you brought up Carey Price's injury. And so it got me thinking, not only because I'm a huge Carey Price fan, and that was devastating last year, but also just, I guess, the public attention that's put on sports injuries. And it's astounding, because it's like you think, okay, well, if I had an injury, it's kind of a personal thing, and yet with athletes, it's like you have millions of people knowing these intricate details about Carey Price's knee or like Gallagher's finger, or like, and I'm wondering if like that kind of public scrutiny or public pressure impacts the way that athletes can recover from injuries, in the sense of like there being this intense pressure on them in this like really embodied way to get better.
Yeah, so there was, let's see, there's a couple things you touched on there. One is the private part, right? With the, when, like you said, when you're injured, that's your own business, but when a professional athlete gets injured, more than one person knows about it. And that's something that really challenges us in athletic therapy when we work with a team or treat an athlete. That is their own private health information, and there's very strict rules about what is disclosed and when for the protection for the athlete for those reasons. But it's a challenge, because people know, and people, when someone's playing and when they're not playing, that people know that. And but that is something that is hard to work with. You also mentioned the pressure, and there's anxiety associated with it, especially in professional athletes when that's their identity and who they are, and when they're injured and they can't play and they can't compete. It's the source of their living. It's also their social network, and it could be very challenging for when someone's injured to rehab with that. And it's one of the things that we probably don't spend enough time on in athletic therapy, on the psychological aspect of the injury, which is part of the reason why I got into this research. But it's really hard to deal with. And when we have graduates from our program, when they get certified and they work with teams, and we have graduates from our program working with the Montreal Canadiens now, and with the Alouettes, and with the major junior Quebec teams, that's a common statement from them, is that I wasn't, it's really hard dealing with the psychological part of the injury, in addition to the just the regular rehab. So no, it's a challenge.
Anybody else want to make a comment around that? Okay, if not, question just at the back.
I also have a question for Dr. Dovert. I was wondering if you noticed a relation to athletes who have had an injury in the past and have gone through their recovery process versus an athlete who it was maybe their first serious injury and they're new to the process, and how that affected them.
Yeah, that's a good question. They have, I see a difference in the young athlete. So if in the adolescence, 8 to 12, when that person gets injured, it's usually the worst thing ever that's happened, and they haven't experienced before, and they don't know exactly what to expect, and that's very challenging. And then in general, when people have experienced an injury before, they know more what to expect, but there's still, it's not as clear as you'd think because, if you've torn your ACL before and you can be out for a year, and then if you tear it again and you know that it's gone, that's a real challenge now because you know exactly what you did the last time. And so it can even be harder the second time recovering from something like that. So it's not always where if you're more experienced with it, it's not a big deal. It can be harder sometimes, depending if they've, had to go through it. They know exactly what they have to go through again. And that can be tough.
So whilst people are thinking about this, oh, sorry. Oh, there. Beg your pardon. Thank you.
So have you considered how the results of taking the questionnaire can affect the therapist, like how they treat the patients directly, and how that can bias or lead to this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that if you know it's going to take longer, then you treat them differently than the ones who have different results?
Yep, that's exactly right. So right now, when we design a rehabilitation program, we focused almost exclusively about the biomedical part, as what I was saying before, in terms of how much range of motion they're missing or how much strength. And what we're trying to work towards is that if someone is struggling with pain or pain-related fear, unless we target that as part of the rehabilitation, as that on our list of aims that we need to address, then it's not going to get better, and they're going to prolong their rehabilitation. So that part, it's hard enough convincing people that the pain-related fear is important for athletes, and so we've been focusing on that mostly. But there's less information out there in terms of once they have it, what can we do to reduce it? So there's some cognitive behavioral programs that people have done that have had success with reducing pain-related fear. But they want it to be able to, so a clinician, like an athletic therapist or a physiotherapist, could be able to do it at a clinic. So now they have a cognitive behavioral-based PT program that has been used now to reduce pain-related fear, and that's out of Dr. George, who's in Duke University now, and he studies a lot of, they're starting to work on that. So we have some plans for things like that moving forward.
Okay, so I'm going to take host prerogative and ask the last question, because I know after hand cheese, everyone is hungry. So in the spirit of this being Wellness Week, and me coming from a very health perspective, as you reflect upon the research that you've done, moving forward, what is the greatest contribution you see your areas of research impacting upon wellness or health in the future? So who's brave enough to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
And just as for the record, there is no hand cheese available to eat back there. Hold on. I think that with the work that I'm doing, the potential for it to impact nutrition on an individual scale, but also for kind of household food security, I think is really important. And so I think one of the biggest takeaways that, or one of the takeaways that I hope to instill through my research is the work of mindful eating, right? Evelyn Trivoli talks about this, and this idea of food is not just calories, food is not just grams of proteins and grams of carbohydrates and micronutrients and macronutrients. It is that too, but it's not just that. It is also a sense of nourishment. It's a sense of identity. It's deeply personal. Food is extremely personal. It shows us who you are. It reinforces traditions, both on a family level, on a cultural level, on a regional level. And so I think remaining mindful of all of that with every bite that you take has tremendous implications. It's also extremely difficult. So there's that.
I would say I'm interested in confronting ableism present in our perspective about health. For example, deaf people are often considered as only person with deafness that have to be cured, for example, with the cochlear implant. So I'm more interested about what are deaf people existential stance, how we can develop knowledge and epistemological perspective that are in sign language. We don't have that time for this question, but I was wondering, for example, with Jeff, what will be the difference if we were asking disabled athletes about their perspective on pain, or about also the perspective on how pain is socially constructed regarding ableism and capacitism. Yeah.
That sounds like a good idea for what I should start working on now. But no, I think we talked about it before, really coming up with a plan to treat with athletes if they have a pain-related fear, a way to address that so they can return to play sooner. But really it's about understanding pain and why some people feel more pain than others, so that once we understand that, we can help reduce the amount of pain people feel, like when the people with chronic pain conditions and fibromyalgia or low back pain, to be able to treat them better so that they can get back to increase their activities of daily life.
Just to comment in general on wellness, lifestyle, and understanding the brain and the body, we have actually a great center just dedicated to that, which is, of course, across the street, the Perform Center, which mainly aims into that. And we have lots of nice, of course, there are lots of platforms to study physical activity, nutrition, sleep, and so on. And we're coming with lots of nice tools, like standard tools, like we go to an MRI scan, and more like portable device, like portable techniques to measure brain activity, like blood flow or neuronal, and to study that during you do a physical exercise, during nutrition after nutrition-specific diet, and so on. So lots of very interesting tools. And most importantly, those tools, like the one I mentioned, we try to have them portable and, if possible, as cheap as possible. And I would give an example from a colleague of mine, Get a Bit Old. It's coming from Cuba, who did a very great experience with EEG, where he developed some systems with EEG to detect very early, as a prevention, early death problem in Cuba for young kids. And he was able to predict that and to make an apparatus for them very early, and that was at least 20 years ago or something. And so these are like some very nice technology, but even cheap, can really help prevention and health.
So I think I would just say that although much of what I study is expertise, so people who are expert musicians, expert dancers, what we really want to know about is change in the brain, change as we grow and develop, and change that we might be able to help affect in people who've suffered an injury or some kind of an illness. So maybe I should change from studying brain plasticity to studying brain elasticity, so the idea of getting function back. So that's, I think, the contribution that I hope that my work can make.
Wonderful. So I want to thank the panel. They will be around later if you have further questions.
So Vero, Christophe, Virginia, Maya, and Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's been wonderful to hear all of you. There are lots of things we've learned tonight about the mind and body, or body and mind. So the first question that Simon asked to the group, we've reflected on it with the title. It's "and" that we put in, right? And so the images that came to the publicity was also to have the mind and the body separated. That was intended. So the question came right. So is it two parts interacting, or is it one? I have my own view on this, but I appreciated yours. There are lots of things happening in Beyond Disciplines, and one thing is we'll learn a tremendous amount about the mind and the body. But one thing that was quite interesting for us tonight is also to look at how we learn. And so tonight was a meeting of the humanities in some ways with the sciences. And that's a match that's quite rare in many places, because it's difficult to get these people together. In the Faculty of Arts and Science, we can actually do that because we're all on the same roof, all the same umbrella. But one thing about the ways of learning, which is interesting, is that we go from research creation, we go from imagery experiments, we go from embodied learning, we go from videography in terms of expressing different stories and languages. And that is a richness in the Faculty of Arts and Science of combining all these methodologies into sort of the learning. So thank you so much for sharing those aspects of learning, the way we do, so that it creates some kind of I'd say, connections across our disciplines. And, ladies and gentlemen, this is Beyond Disciplines. A few words of thanks, and it starts with our own Department of Exercise Science has been instrumental in making this happen. The Student Association of the department has been very, very active, and actually they volunteer, but also they will host us just after this. But also we have our chair, Richard Courtemanche, and Christina Grace, who were very, very, very present in sort of making this happen and really organize this. So perhaps they'd like to say a couple of words, maybe Richard and Christina?
Well, just to mention a great thank you to the students that have organized Wellness Week this week. It's Simon has said it. It's really impressive. It's going on to the 10th year, the 9th year. It's really been quite an accomplishment every year. Thank you to everybody who showed up. It's an amazing turnout. And I just want to recognize, too, that, the staff in the Department of Exercise Science has helped this Wellness Week and try to shape this aspect of trying to reach out to the other departments. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you for having this event. It's really fun. It's really fun.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Do you want to say a word?
Sure, just one last little thing. So thank you to everyone who has contributed to Wellness Week. Just a final reminder that there's a donation box for the Heart and Stroke Foundation. If you have not helped us yet, we would appreciate any donation you can. And we're also selling a few raffle tickets for a couple of prizes that were given to us for this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, Christina and Richard, thank you very much. I'd like to remind everyone here that we also have a podcast for this series of Beyond Disciplines, and I'd like to thank Aaron Lakoff here and Simon Lucas for being our podcast squad this year and doing a fantastic job. So if you want to see previous episodes of Season 1 or Season 2, they're all available, and you just go on the website, Beyond Disciplines webpage, and you'll find them. iTunes, yep. So widely available. So there's no reason why you wouldn't look at them. Right. I'd like to thank all of you for coming in such large number. It's fantastic to have you. It's another example of how Beyond Disciplines brings people together in ways. But one thing that happens at Beyond Disciplines as well is that there's always opportunity to discuss even more and comment and meet our panelists with the reception. And with the reception, in many occasions, we do have other types of things that we can experiment with. So there's some things that you can play with. And I'd like to thank the students again, because the reception is basically theirs. And for all the volunteering and support that they've provided to make this event happen and Wellness Week to make such a success. So thank you very much. Now, I always say this. I know each one of you. I know. So please stay for the reception, because I'll check your name. All right, thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful.